so much. And may I just say, what a lovely service. That's just been delightful. And also, thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. As you know, I'm here with the League of Women Voters of Orange Coast. And the reason I work with the League is because their mission is to empower voters. And it also is to defend democracy. My main mission is to talk about ballot propositions, which I will do later today. And I do that because, well, they're kind of complicated, and sometimes it helps to have someone do the legwork to explain them. But some of you may know me from Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, which is my first love. And we've been protecting church-state separation for over 75 years now. But today I want to talk about voting. And these two organizations are not dissimilar in how they approach it. And of course, the bottom line message is please vote. I'm not going to tell you how to vote, but just be sure you do vote. I was recently given a mug from the League of Women Voters that says, vote as if your life depends on it. And I kind of think it does this year. One of the things that I do want to talk about is the Constitution and what the Constitution says about voting. And you'll find that I'm passionate on this topic because I'm a naturalized citizen. I've voted in every election since I was naturalized, and that's 50 plus years of voting. So as I'm sure you know, neither of my organizations supports parties or candidates or opposes parties or candidates, but we are both very vocal on the issues. In fact, I met your Minister Kent working on the fight on Prop 8, so that was many years ago, and it was great. Our goal is to understand public policy and understand how these policies come about. So what I'm going to talk about today is the importance of preserving our democracy. And the only way to do that is through voting. So I urge you to join me and proudly cast your vote. I know you're all aware of the importance of voting. At least I hope you are. But in speaking to groups around the county, I found that the history of voting rights isn't always known, so that seems like a good place to start. So let's start with the Declaration of Independence and what it says about voting. And oops, they left voting out. So what does the Declaration say? And I'm sure you're all going to remember this from school days, is that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. But it doesn't answer the question about how this consent of the governed would actually work. And what's the deal with instituted among men? It's a good reminder that whether you're a man or a woman, this is an important election for women. And not just for you, but for your daughters, for your granddaughters. But back to the Declaration. So the founders, led by James Madison, worried about the rights of minorities. And I always thought he was a good guy, so worrying about the rights of minorities is a good thing. But his minorities are not anything like our minorities. To Madison, minorities were the property owners, while those who didn't have any land were the majority. So those were the rights he was worried about. So much for the Declaration. Time to move on to the Constitution. Well, originally the Constitution left the decisions on voting to the individual states to determine who gets to vote. But fortunately, the Constitution did say that Congress could make a law to modify those decisions. Good thing, too, no one will be surprised that letting individual states do it resulted in some very unfair voting practices. Some states restricted voting to white males who own property. Other states added a religious test to make sure that only white Christian men could vote. I'm kind of feel a little threatened about all of this. And then, of course, there were the poll taxes and the literacy tests. So, as you know, voting has been contested throughout our history. So we're done with the Constitution, time to bring on the Bill of Rights, and especially the First Amendment. I am a particular fan of the first 16 words that says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In my opinion, these are the words that make America great. And they are the basis of Americans United for separation of church and state. So they are particularly meaningful to me. I come from a country with an established state religion. And people will say, well, that's not such a big deal because it doesn't really impact your life. Well, it did impact mine. When I was in elementary school, we started every day with an assembly to prepare for the day. And part of that assembly was a morning prayer. But I wasn't part of that because the Jewish kids were not allowed in the assembly until after prayers were over. Then we walked in and everyone turned to stare at us because we were the outcasts. I've never forgotten that. I worry about those that try to impose their brand of religion on kids today, and that's why I work with Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. The organization was founded in 1947 in reaction to a U.S. Supreme Court decision allowing indirect support for religious education. A group of religious, educational, and civic leaders came together to create an organization uniquely dedicated to defending the American principle of separation of church and state. Although it was heavily Protestant at its founding, as the years passed, the organization began attracting support from non-Christian and non-theistic individuals in growing numbers. Today, Americans United is a broad-based movement that includes people of all faith and non-faith perspectives, genders, sexual orientations, political affiliations, and ethnic backgrounds. The current president of Americans United is a Reformed Jew. One of my favorite board members is a almost violent atheist. I love him very, very much. So whenever anyone tries to impose religion, I will be there to oppose it. And during the 2000 presidential election, for those of you who can remember that far back, George W. Bush brought theology into that race. He once told an Austin reporter that only those who have accepted Christ as their Savior can enter the kingdom of heaven. And I learned that from my friend Eddie, who is the violent atheist, and that's why we created the Orange County chapter of Americans United. And both Americans United and the League of Women Voters rely on these amendments. And that's because the Constitution, amazingly, does not guarantee a right to vote. The 14th Amendment granted African American men, the rights of citizenship, but that did not mean the right to vote. And it certainly didn't mean everyone. I mean, what if you were a woman? Certainly no voting for you. And if you didn't have property, you couldn't vote either. So eventually, then Congress passed the 15th Amendment that said people couldn't be denied the right to vote because of their race. Didn't say anything about gender. Of course, that didn't stop many states from using a range of barriers, particularly poll taxes and literacy tests to reduce voting. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, so all good, right? Not exactly. Consider that in the 1930s, one Georgia man described the situation by saying, "Do you know, I've never voted in my life. Never been able to exercise my right as a citizen because of the poll tax. I can't pay poll tax. I can't have a voice in my own government." And what about the women? In 1776, Abigail Adams beseeched John to remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Well, that didn't happen. Women didn't get the vote until the 19th Amendment. And as I said, you go back to the 14th Amendment and you see that all the voters were men. Women have their work cut out for them. The women's suffrage movement started in 1848, and it took 30 years for the 19th Amendment to get a hearing in Congress, and then another 70 years for it to get ratified. So the last state to ratify was Tennessee, and it was a close call. In fact, the people in the women's movement said, Tennessee, it's just not going to happen. But Harry Burns was a young Republican legislator and cast the decisive vote. His mother had left him a note in his pocket to vote for suffrage. And so he did. You always do what mom says, right? But it was only good for white women. Tennessee put up a monument to women's suffrage, but specified it was only for white women. So it's not that progressive. The League of Women Voters was officially founded in Chicago in 1920, just 6 months before the 19th Amendment was ratified and women won the vote. It was formed by the suffragists of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, and the League began as a mighty political experiment designed to help 20 million women carry out their new responsibilities as voters. And we carry that on today. But what does it mean to ratify an amendment? This is really an interesting part, because it's not just that it's approved by 2/3 of both houses of Congress, but then it's off to the states, and 3/4 of the states have to ratify it through their state legislatures. But have you ever wondered about the 1/4 that didn't ratify? They still have to follow the rules and allow women to vote, but what message are they sending to the people of their state when they don't ratify amendments like this? Maryland didn't ratify until 1941. And there were 5 southern states who've waited to ratify between 1969 and 1971. But the prize goes to Mississippi. It was the last state to ratify. It ratified in 1984. In case you were wondering, California was one of the first states to ratify and had actually given women the right to vote in 1911. The very first state to ratify was Utah. I talk about these things because they make me crazy. I mean, what if you lived somewhere that didn't let you vote for president? That was the case for residents of Washington, D.C. They got the 23rd Amendment passed, which extends the right to vote in presidential elections to citizens residing in the District of Columbia. It was ratified in March 1961. And why was it needed? It's because the District of Columbia is not a state, and its residents don't have the right to vote in federal elections. The slogan on D.C. license plates, if you've ever been there, you'll have seen this, is no taxation without representation. And they still get taxed, and representation is not what it should be. Congress basically runs what happens in D.C. and can limit anything the citizens vote on. For example, the D.C. mayor had approved a law supporting medical aid in dying, which is another one of my big issues. Some of you know this. And Congress said, well, we're not sure about this. We're going to review this. They eventually decided not to make any changes, but they can review all D.C. legislation before it can become law and can modify or even overturn such legislation. In 1973, Congress passed the Home Rule Act to extend to the district a measure of autonomy, including the power to elect a mayor and a council. But as you can see, they have extremely limited powers. Since its creation, the district has sometimes been treated like a state, and the district is deemed to be a state for the purpose of levying and collecting federal and local taxes, for service in the armed forces, for diversity jurisdiction, and for regulating commerce. But the district is not considered a state for the purpose of congressional representation, hence the license plate. Nothing in the 23rd Amendment grants the district statehood, nor does it provide residents with representation in the Senate or the House of Representatives. Though by congressional legislation, the residents have long had the right to elect a non-voting delegate to the House. And, you know, she's wonderful and she does great things, but she's completely powerless. In 1978, Congress adopted the District of Columbia Voting Rights Amendment, which would have given the district seats in the House of Representatives and the Senate. It did not pass. The next amendment that dealt with voting was the 24th. In 1964, the 24th Amendment was ratified. Get this, it prohibited the use of poll taxes. 1964. Many have asked with the 15th Amendment, why do we need the 24th? Simply because the 15th Amendment did not waive any financial requirements to voting. And southern states from the Confederacy adopted poll tax laws in the late 19th century as a measure to prevent African Americans as well as other poor citizens from voting. Part of the lead-up to the 24th was in 1937 by a white Georgia man who challenged the constitutionality of the poll tax. He went to the Supreme Court. He lost 9-0 based on the reasoning that states may determine eligibility as they see fit, as long as they do not implement them based on race. And the poll tax actually is not based on race. It's based on whether you can afford to pay the poll tax. So this Supreme Court decision, like many others, was a major setback for voting rights. When the 24th Amendment was ratified in 1964, 5 states still retained a poll tax. And there's no quiz for this, but the states are Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, Texas, and Virginia. So the amendment prohibited requiring a poll tax for voters in federal elections, but it wasn't until 1966 that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that poll tax for any level of election were unconstitutional because it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th. In 1971, the 26th Amendment was ratified, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. California has, since the 1980s, allowed persons who are 17 to register to vote for an election where the election itself will occur on or after their 18th birthday. So, those of you who have grandchildren, keep that in mind. Some states allow 17-year-olds to vote in the primaries or caucuses if their 18th birthday is before the general election. So the struggle for equal voting rights really came to a head in the 60s. In March 1965 were protest marches from Selma to Montgomery to spotlight the issue of black voting rights, and that first march came to be known as Bloody Sunday. The right to vote is the foundation of any democracy, Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote, and the right to vote freely for the candidate of one's choice is of the essence of a democratic society. And any restrictions on that right strike at the heart of representative government. Boy, did he get that right. And Justice Hugo Black shared the same sentiment in 1964 when he said, "No right is more precious in a free country than that of having a voice in the election of those who make the laws under which, as good citizens, we must live. Other rights, even the most basic, are illusory if the right to vote is undermined." So those statements are true today just as much as they were 60 years ago, and that is why it is so important that you go out and exercise your right to vote. It doesn't matter where you are on the political spectrum, you need to make your views heard, and there's no better way, in fact it's the only way, to do it through the ballot box. So I would like to conclude today with recalling what a wise lawyer once said. If you care about the outcome, you must participate. You can give $1 a day or an hour of your time, but you must do something, and I hope you all will. Thank you.